The first thing I remember was the sound of running footsteps. Not shuffling, not dragging, running. Fast enough to make the hardwood floor tremble beneath my feet. I turned toward the hallway just in time to see 16-year-old Ethan Whitmore sprint past me in socks, nearly sliding around the corner as he rushed toward the kitchen. 3 seconds earlier, Ethan had been sitting in a wheelchair he supposedly hadn't left in almost 3 years. "Wait," I shouted. He didn't answer. The sharp smell hit me at the same moment he reached the stove. Gas. Natural gas. Ethan twisted the burner knob off with one hand, reached beneath the sink cabinet with the other, and shut the emergency valve that fed the kitchen line. Then he threw open the back door. The January air rushed inside. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I stood frozen beside the dining room table, still holding the mug of coffee I'd been carrying. Ethan leaned against the counter, breathing hard. Finally, he looked up at me. His expression wasn't fear. It wasn't embarrassment. It was exhaustion. The kind that settles into a person after carrying something heavy for far too long. "Please," he said quietly, "don't tell my father you saw that." 3 hours earlier, I would have sworn under oath that Ethan Whitmore couldn't move his legs. 3 hours earlier, I had watched General Robert Whitmore lift his son from bed to wheelchair with the kind of practiced gentleness that only comes from repetition and love. 3 hours earlier, I would have bet my life on it. I set the coffee mug down before I dropped it. "Excuse me," I managed. Ethan looked away toward the window. "Please." That was all he said. Just please. The word hung in the room between the smell of gas and the cold winter air drifting through the open door. And standing there in my fiancé's kitchen at 58 years old, I realized I had just stepped into the middle of a secret that could destroy an entire family. My name is Claire Bennett. For 32 years, I taught 4th grade at Jefferson Elementary outside Richmond, Virginia. I buried my husband Mark 11 years ago after pancreatic cancer took him in less than 6 months. For a long time, I believed the rest of my life would be quiet. Not lonely exactly, just smaller. Then I met Robert Whitmore. We met in the least romantic place imaginable, the produce section of a grocery store. He was studying 2 brands of tomatoes with the seriousness of a man planning a military operation. I laughed. He looked up and said, "One of these has significantly better structural integrity." I answered, "They're tomatoes, General." He grinned. Retired soldiers have to direct their energy somewhere. We had coffee the next week. By the 3rd date, I knew 2 things. First, Robert Whitmore was one of the kindest men I'd ever met. Second, he carried enough grief to fill an entire house. His wife Susan had died from ovarian cancer 6 years earlier. His son Ethan had suffered severe injuries in a boating accident less than a year after that. The details always remained vague. Robert never hid anything exactly. But he spoke about the accident the way people speak about funerals. Briefly. Carefully. As if saying too much might reopen wounds that had barely closed. By the time we became engaged, 8 months later, Ethan was still the one part of Robert's life that remained distant from me. Polite. Respectful. Silent. At family dinners, he answered questions with one-word responses. "Yes, ma'am." "No, ma'am." "Fine." "School's okay." He never caused trouble. Never rolled his eyes. Never acted rude. In some ways, that almost made it harder. You can argue with anger. You can respond to disrespect. But you can't push your way through silence. "He's still finding his footing," Robert would say. "I know." "He isn't rejecting you." "I know." "He misses his mother." That part I understood better than Robert realized. Grief doesn't move in straight lines, especially for children. The call from Washington came on a Tuesday evening. Robert listened quietly for nearly 20 minutes before setting his phone down. "They need me overseas for 2 weeks," he said. I could see he hated the words as he spoke them. Even after retirement, certain doors never fully closed for men who had spent 40 years carrying stars on their shoulders. "Can you go?" "I have to." Then he hesitated. "There is something I need to ask you." 2 days later, I stood in his driveway beside a silver SUV loaded with luggage. Robert adjusted Ethan's blanket across his lap, even though the boy insisted he wasn't cold. "His medication schedule is on the refrigerator." I saw it. "The physical therapist comes Thursday." "Okay." "He doesn't like peas." Ethan sighed. "Dad." Robert ignored him. "The emergency numbers are beside the coffee maker." I smiled. "Robert, I taught 4th graders for 3 decades. I promise I can survive 2 weeks. His expression softened. "This is different." He wasn't talking about Ethan's medical needs. He was talking about his heart. Robert squeezed my hand. "He isn't angry at you, Claire." I nodded. "He's angry at the whole world." Then he kissed my forehead, climbed into the SUV, and drove down the street. Ethan and I stood in silence until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. I was about to suggest lunch when I smelled it. Gas. At first I thought perhaps Robert had left a burner running. Then came the footsteps. Fast footsteps. The sound of a healthy teenage boy running through the house. The next 30 seconds changed everything I thought I understood about the Whitmore family. And now Ethan stood across from me in his father's kitchen. Standing. Actually standing. His wheelchair sat abandoned in the hallway. The winter wind moved the curtains behind him. Finally I found my voice. "How long?" I asked. His shoulders fell. "A while." "Ethan?" He closed his eyes. 3 years. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Not because of the lie. Because of what kind of pain it must take for a 16-year-old boy to believe he had to live inside one. He opened his eyes again. "Please don't make me tell him yet." I looked at the frightened young man standing where a wheelchair had been moments earlier. And for reasons I couldn't yet explain, I had the feeling this story wasn't going to be about deception. It was going to be about heartbreak. I just didn't know whose. The secret was out between Ethan and me, but the reasons behind it were still hidden in the shadows. I didn't sleep much that first night. Not because I was afraid. Because I was trying to make sense of what I'd seen. At 2 a.m, I sat at Robert's kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and replayed the scene over and over in my head. The footsteps. The gas. The way Ethan had moved without hesitation. Most of all, the look on his face afterward. Not triumph. Not relief. Guilt. Heavy old guilt. The kind that doesn't arrive overnight. By 7 the next morning I could hear movement upstairs. Actual movement. Footsteps crossing a bedroom floor. A dresser drawer opening. A closet door shutting. The sounds felt almost unreal in a house that had supposedly been arranged around a boy who couldn't walk. A few minutes later, Ethan appeared in the kitchen. In the wheelchair. His expression told me immediately that he remembered every second of the previous afternoon. "So," I said carefully. "So." He stared at the refrigerator. "I guess you're wondering if you're losing your mind." That crossed my mind once or twice. A tiny smile flickered across his face before disappearing again. I poured coffee for myself and hot chocolate for him. "Help me understand." He wrapped both hands around the mug. For nearly a full minute he said nothing. Then finally, "I can walk." "I know." "I've been able to for a long time." "How long?" He stared down into the cup. "Almost 3 years." Hearing the words spoken out loud somehow made them heavier. 3 years. 3 birthdays. 3 Christmas mornings. 3 years of doctor's appointments, therapy schedules, wheelchair ramps, modified bathrooms, accessible vehicles, and carefully planned routines. 3 years of his father carrying a burden that no parent should ever have to carry. "Does your doctor know?" He nodded. "My rehabilitation doctor discharged me almost 2 years ago." I blinked. "What?" "He signed confidentiality paperwork." "How?" I was 15. Dad had already signed forms giving me certain privacy rights during treatment. I sat back in my chair. The scale of this thing kept growing every time he spoke. "Ethan, why?" His jaw tightened. "Because I was angry. Angry enough to do this for 3 years." His eyes lifted to meet mine. "You don't know what happened." "Then tell me." He looked toward the window. Snow clouds hung low over the neighborhood. Finally he spoke. "My mom died when I was 12. I nodded quietly. "I know." "No, you know she died. That's not the same thing." He wasn't being rude. Just honest. "When Mom got sick, Dad was still active duty. He was gone a lot. Meetings, flights, conferences, briefings." His fingers tightened around the mug. "He came home every chance he got. I know that now, but back then all I understood was that Mom was dying and Dad wasn't there." He swallowed. "Then she died anyway." The kitchen fell silent. After losing Mark, I knew there were no useful words for moments like that. You listened. That was all. "Dad retired 6 months later," Ethan continued. "He said he wanted to focus on family. But by then it felt too late." He looked away. Then came the boating accident. Robert had told me very little about it. Only that bad weather had rolled in faster than expected on a lake trip with friends. A collision. Several surgeries. Months in rehabilitation. "The doctors thought I might never walk again," Ethan said quietly. "For a while they were probably right." I nodded. And then I got lucky." He gave a humorless laugh. "Luck and physical therapy and stubbornness." "Your father must have been thrilled." His expression changed. There it was. The wound. The real wound. One day during rehab, I was practicing standing with parallel bars. His voice grew distant. Dad was outside my room talking to another officer from the Pentagon. He looked down at the table. I heard him say something. I waited. At least now he'll stay close. Maybe he finally needs me. The words landed hard. I understood immediately why a hurting teenager might hear cruelty in them. If being broken was what made him stay. Ethan said quietly, then I stayed broken. I stared at him. Ethan? He started showing up for everything. Football games became physical therapy appointments. Business trips disappeared. He called every doctor personally. Tears gathered in his eyes. He knew where every medication was kept, every therapy exercise, every wheelchair repair number. His voice cracked. For the first time since Mom died, I had my dad back. The room went silent. Not because I approved. I didn't. But because I understood. Grief and loneliness make bargains with us, sometimes terrible ones. So you kept pretending. He nodded. At first it was supposed to be temporary. His laugh sounded tired. Then weeks became months, and months became years. Yeah. He rubbed his forehead. After a while, I didn't know how to stop. I believed him. Every year made the next confession harder. Every sacrifice Robert made raised the price of the truth. Were you trying to punish him? I asked. He considered the question. At first, he nodded slowly. Yeah. And now, his eyes filled again. Now I think I'm mostly punishing myself. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Do you love your father? He looked almost offended. Of course I do. And does he love you? His answer came instantly. More than anything. Then this isn't a story about hate. He frowned. Then what is it? I looked at the young man sitting across from me. A story about two people grieving the same person and misunderstanding each other for years. He didn't answer, but he didn't disagree either. That evening after dinner, I passed the family room and saw him standing alone by the window. Not sitting, standing. Watching snow begin to fall across the backyard. He looked older somehow. Not 16. Not even 26. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying a secret long after it stops protecting you. Without turning around, he spoke. Do you think he'll ever forgive me? I considered the question carefully. I think the better question is whether you'll ever forgive yourself. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he whispered, I don't know how to get out of this anymore. I looked at the boy who had built himself a prison and then forgotten where he'd hidden the key. And for the first time since meeting Ethan Whitmore, I realized something important. The lie wasn't the real tragedy. The tragedy was that somewhere along the way, both father and son had become convinced that love had conditions attached to it. Before I could decide what to do with Ethan's secret, I needed to answer a question that had been growing louder in my mind since the kitchen incident. Had Robert really meant what Ethan thought he meant? The next morning began with routine. That surprised me. After everything that had happened, I expected awkwardness, tension, maybe even avoidance. Instead, Ethan came downstairs in his wheelchair at 8 sharp. I made scrambled eggs. He toasted bread. We talked about the weather. Normal things. Ordinary things. Sometimes ordinary conversations are the strangest ones of all. Especially when both people know a bomb is sitting in the middle of the room. By Wednesday afternoon, I found myself studying Robert's life with new eyes. Not snooping. Not exactly. Simply noticing things I had overlooked before. The wheelchair ramp leading to the front porch wasn't new. It was beautifully built, stained to match the house perfectly. Someone had cared enough to make it look like it belonged there. The downstairs bathroom renovation had obviously been expensive. Custom shower access, wider doorways, modified counters. The family room furniture had been rearranged to create easier movement through the house. Every change whispered the same message. Someone had rebuilt an entire life around a son they loved. That evening, I stood in Robert's study looking for printer paper when I noticed a photograph sitting on the bookshelf. It showed Robert and Ethan standing beside a fishing boat. Ethan looked maybe 11. Robert had one arm around his shoulders. Both of them were laughing at something outside the frame. The picture had been taken before Susan died, before the accident, before grief moved into the house and rearranged all the furniture in their hearts. I set the picture back down. Beside it sat an old leather notebook. Its cover was worn soft with age. Military habit, I assumed. Many officers keep journals. I shouldn't have opened it. Even now I know that. But the notebook fell open in my hands. The first page I saw wasn't military strategy or retirement notes. It was a date, October 14th. Beneath it, written in Robert's careful handwriting. Ethan stood for 14 seconds today during therapy. 14 seconds. I have commanded thousands of soldiers and attended meetings with presidents, but I have never been prouder of anyone in my life." I stopped breathing for a moment. I turned the page. Today he walked 6 steps with support bars. He apologized for being slow. I told him there are men who crossed oceans less bravely. Another page. He smiled today during lunch, first real smile in weeks. Another. He thinks I don't notice when he cries after therapy sessions. I notice everything. I closed the notebook. My throat felt tight. This wasn't obligation. This wasn't guilt. This wasn't a man relieved that his injured son would stay close. This was love. Messy, imperfect, terrified love. The kind parents carry whether their children are 6 or 60. That night I called my daughter Megan in Ohio. I didn't reveal Ethan's secret, but I needed perspective. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Sure." If a parent says something clumsy during a painful moment, can a child carry that misunderstanding for years? Megan laughed softly. Mom families have survived entire decades on misunderstandings. That's not exactly comforting. It's true, though. She paused. "Remember Grandpa?" I smiled. My father had spent 20 years believing his own father was disappointed in him. The truth came out after my grandfather's funeral. He had been proud beyond words. He had simply grown up in a generation where men showed love through roofs repaired and bills paid, not conversations. By the time they understood each other, they had already lost decades. "People hear what their pain prepares them to hear," Megan said quietly. After we hung up, I sat alone in the dark for a long time. The next afternoon, Ethan found me on the back porch. "You've been quiet. So have you." "Fair point." He lowered himself carefully into the porch swing beside me. Not the wheelchair. The swing. For a second I wondered if he realized what a milestone that was. He followed my gaze and gave a weak smile. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" "A little." We sat in silence, listening to wind move through bare trees. Finally I spoke. "Your father kept journals during your rehabilitation." His expression tightened immediately. "You read them?" "A few pages." He looked away. "Was he angry?" "No." "Disappointed?" "No." "Then what?" I thought carefully before answering. "Proud." He frowned. "Proud? Every exercise, every improvement, every step." His eyes narrowed. "That doesn't mean anything." "It means something." "No, it means he was proud I was fighting." "Maybe." He looked toward the yard. "But that isn't the same thing as wanting me." There it was again. The fear underneath everything else. Not anger. Not revenge. Abandonment. I turned toward him. "Ethan, when my husband was sick, there were days I sat beside his hospital bed for 14 hours straight." He listened quietly. "Do you know why?" "Because you loved him." "Exactly." I nodded toward the house. "People don't rebuild homes, careers, schedules, and futures for someone they don't want." He didn't answer. His jaw tightened. "Because part of him already knew. The problem with old wounds isn't that they refuse to heal. It's that they become part of your identity. Healing feels like losing a piece of yourself." That evening, I found another notebook in Robert's study. This one wasn't a journal. It was a stack of letters. Dozens of them. Every envelope carried Ethan's name. None had stamps. None had been mailed. The earliest one began, "Dear Ethan, I know you're angry that I have to travel this week. The doctors say your therapy schedule can't be interrupted and neither can the meetings overseas. If I could split myself into 2 people, I would." Another read, "Today I watched a father teach his son to ride a bicycle outside the embassy. I hated him for 5 minutes because he got to be there and I didn't." Another, "If I could trade places with you, son, I'd sign the paper before the pen hit the desk." I closed the final letter and stared out the study window. A decorated soldier. A respected leader. A man who could command entire divisions. And yet somehow he couldn't find a way to hand his son a letter that said, "I love you." Across the hall, Ethan's bedroom door remained closed. Inside sat a 16-year-old boy who couldn't find a way to stand up and say, "I missed you." 2 people. 1 house. 3 years of silence. And somewhere in the middle of it all sat me, a retired 4th-grade teacher who suddenly understood something very important. This family didn't need a detective. It didn't need a judge. It needed a translator. The strange thing about revenge is that it rarely looks the way we imagine it will. Sometimes it arrives with shouting. Sometimes with lawsuits. Sometimes with slammed doors and broken relationships. And sometimes it arrives quietly in the form of a 16-year-old boy sitting across from a woman old enough to be his grandmother, finally admitting that the victory he'd spent 3 years chasing no longer felt like winning. "I want to show you something." Ethan looked up from his cereal bowl. It was Friday morning. Gray skies hung over northern Virginia, and a light rain tapped against the kitchen windows. "Show me what—" "Your father." He frowned. "My father is in Germany. Not that version of him." For the first time in days, genuine curiosity crossed his face. An hour later, we were driving through town in my old Subaru. Not in Robert's modified van. Not with the wheelchair lift. Just a retired teacher and a teenage boy who kept glancing nervously out the window as though someone might recognize him. He wore jeans and an old navy sweatshirt. No wheelchair. No blanket over his legs. No carefully arranged appearance of fragility. He looked exactly like what he was. A healthy 16-year-old boy. "You realize this is probably illegal somehow," he muttered. "I taught public school for 32 years, I said. "If it was illegal, I'd probably know by now." That earned me the smallest smile. Our first stop was a diner near the base. The kind of place with laminated menus and waitresses who call everyone honey, regardless of age. The waitress recognized Ethan immediately. "Well, hello there, sweetheart." Then she froze. Her eyes dropped to his legs, to the fact that he was standing. Very wisely, she said nothing. Instead, she simply smiled. "What can I get you folks?" After she walked away, Ethan stared at the menu. "She knows my dad." "I know." "Half this town knows my dad." That was true. Retired 4-star generals don't disappear quietly into civilian life, particularly not ones who had spent years involved in military family advocacy programs. A few minutes later, an older man approached our table. Retired Army by the look of him. Silver hair. Straight posture. He smiled at Ethan. "Good seeing you out and about, son." Then he looked at me. "Robert, still doing too much and sleeping too little." I laughed. "That sounds accurate." The man shook his head. "That fool practically lived at that rehabilitation center." Ethan looked up sharply. The man didn't notice. "He used to come in here every morning at 6 before therapy sessions started." The man smiled sadly. "Wouldn't even order breakfast some days, just coffee." He nodded toward Ethan. "Said he couldn't eat until he knew how his boy was doing." The man tipped an imaginary hat and returned to his booth. Ethan stared down at his plate. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. After breakfast, I drove us to a marina about 20 minutes outside town. The lake sat quiet beneath low clouds. "Why are we here?" he asked. "Your father comes here sometimes." We found 2 older men repairing fishing equipment near one of the docks. The moment they saw Ethan, both smiled. "Look who finally escaped the house," one called. The other laughed. "Your dad still tells everyone he can outfish both of us combined." "He can't." "Of course he can't." The first man wiped his hands on a rag. "You know he sold his cabin for you, right?" Ethan blinked. "What?" "The Montana place." The man pointed toward the lake. "Best fishing property I've ever seen." His smile faded. "Sold it to help cover your treatment expenses after insurance stopped paying." The world seemed to go quiet. "I didn't know that," Ethan said softly. The man shrugged. "Robert never wanted anyone making a fuss over it." He returned to his work. "That's father's for you." Back in the car, Ethan stared out the passenger window. "He loved that cabin." "I know." "He and Mom used to go there every summer." I didn't answer, because there wasn't anything useful to say. The next stop was the local Veterans Center. I had called ahead. Retired Colonel James Mercer met us near the entrance. He'd served with Robert for almost 20 years. He shook Ethan's hand. A real handshake. Standing. Again, the colonel asked no questions. Perhaps military men understand secrets better than most people. We sat together in a quiet office. The colonel smiled at Ethan. "Your father talks about exactly 2 things." Ethan managed a weak smile. "The Army and me." "No." The colonel leaned back. "You and you." For the first time, Ethan laughed. A real laugh. The colonel continued. "I watched your father brief cabinet officials after 12-hour flights and somehow still make time to call your therapists before he called his own staff." He folded his hands. "That man fought bureaucrats harder than he ever fought enemies." Ethan looked down. The colonel's voice softened. I once asked him why. He paused. "Do you know what he said?" Ethan shook his head. The colonel smiled. "Wars end," he said, "being his father doesn't." Silence settled over the room. Then the colonel added one final thing. "A lot of soldiers are brave in public, son." His eyes drifted toward the window. "Your father was brave in hospital rooms." On the drive home, Ethan barely spoke. By evening, he sat alone on the back porch, staring across the backyard. I joined him after dinner. For several minutes, we watched the sun disappear behind bare trees. Finally, he spoke. "I think I got what I wanted." I waited. I wanted him to know what it felt like to lose someone. The words sounded awful once they reached the air. His eyes filled immediately. But he already knew what that felt like, didn't he? Susan, his mother, Robert's wife, the great shared absence that haunted both of them. He lost her too. Yes, he nodded slowly. And then I made him lose me while I was still standing right in front of him. Neither of us spoke, because that sentence carried enough weight for both of us. After a while, he whispered, "What kind of person does that?" I looked toward the darkening sky. The kind who was 12 years old when his mother died. He covered his face with his hands. For the first time since the gas leak, he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Like someone mourning years he couldn't get back. Eventually, he looked up. What happens when Dad comes home? I thought about Robert boarding airplanes and writing letters he never mailed. About Ethan building a prison out of anger and grief. About all the years standing between them. Finally, I answered honestly. I don't know. Then I looked at him carefully. But I think you're finally asking the right question. He frowned. Which is, not whether his father would be hurt. Not whether he would be angry. Not whether forgiveness was possible. The question, I said quietly, is whether you're ready to stop punishing both of you. Robert came home on a Sunday afternoon. The sky over Virginia was the color of old steel, and a cold wind pushed dead leaves across the Whitmore driveway as I stood at the kitchen window watching for his SUV. I had spent the previous 48 hours wondering how this moment would happen. Would Ethan tell him immediately? Would he wait? Would fear win one more time? By the time Robert's vehicle finally turned into the driveway, I still didn't know the answer. He's here, I said quietly. Ethan was sitting at the dining room table, in the wheelchair. For several seconds he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even look toward the window. Finally he nodded once. Okay. The front door opened. Then came the familiar sounds of homecoming. Suitcase wheels rolling across hardwood floors. A coat being hung near the door. Robert's voice. I'm back. I hadn't realized until then how much I had missed hearing it in the house. He stepped into the kitchen a moment later looking exhausted. Travel exhausted. The kind that settles into a person's bones after too many airports and too little sleep. But the second he saw Ethan, his entire face softened. Hey, buddy. Hey, Dad. Robert crossed the room and squeezed his son's shoulder. Then he kissed my cheek. I missed you. You look terrible. He smiled. I feel terrible. Good, that means you're home. He laughed. For a moment everything looked normal. Painfully normal. Dinner that evening was roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Robert complained about airline food. I complained about grocery prices. Ethan barely touched his plate. The clock on the kitchen wall sounded louder than usual. Tick, tick, tick. Finally Robert noticed. You okay, son? Ethan looked up. No. Robert immediately straightened. What's wrong? Ethan looked at me, not asking permission, just gathering courage. I gave the smallest nod. His chair scraped softly against the floor. Then something happened that changed all three of our lives. Ethan stood up. The fork slipped from Robert's hand and hit the plate. The sound echoed through the room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. For several seconds, Robert simply stared. His eyes dropped to Ethan's legs, then back to Ethan's face, then back to his legs again. The color slowly disappeared from his face. Ethan, his voice barely existed. Ethan swallowed. I can explain. Robert didn't speak. Please sit down, Dad. Robert remained standing. Ironically, he looked less steady on his feet than his son did. How long? He asked quietly. The room became very still. Ethan's eyes filled immediately. Almost 3 years. The words landed like stones. Robert closed his eyes, not dramatically, not angrily, simply closed them. When he opened them again, he looked older. Not by years, by burdens. 3 years. Yes, Robert nodded once. Then he walked out of the room. No shouting. No accusations. No military thunder. Just silence. Somehow that hurt more. The back door opened and closed. I found him 10 minutes later sitting alone on the porch steps. The winter air had turned sharp. He stared into the darkness beyond the yard. For a long time neither of us spoke. Finally he asked, Did you know? Since the day you left. He nodded. I suppose that explains the look on your face during our phone calls. I'm sorry. He laughed softly. Not amusement. Disbelief. He can walk. Yes. He could always walk. Not always. Robert looked down at his hands. Hands that had held rifles, maps, medals, and command papers. hands that had carried his son from bed to chair for years. I taught him to shave sitting down. The sentence nearly broke me. He asked me once if I thought girls would still date him. His voice cracked. I told him the right one wouldn't care. He swallowed hard. I memorized every medication schedule. I know. I learned how to repair wheelchair brakes. I know. Finally, he looked at me. The strongest man I had ever known looked completely lost. Why, I thought carefully before answering. Because he thought losing the use of his legs was the only thing that brought you back to him. Robert stared at me, then slowly shook his head. Oh God. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. Oh God. For several minutes, the only sound was wind moving through trees. Finally, he spoke. 3 years ago, outside his rehabilitation room, I said something. I nodded. I know. His eyes closed. At least now he'll stay close. Maybe he finally needs me. Yes. He looked out into the darkness. Claire, do you know what I meant? I stayed quiet. I meant maybe he'd finally let me help him. His voice grew rough. Ever since Susan died, every time I tried to help him, he pushed me away. He rubbed his forehead. I wasn't happy he was hurt. He looked toward the house. I was grateful he was alive. The back door opened. Ethan stepped onto the porch. For a second, all three of us simply stood there inside the cold silence. Then Ethan spoke. I know that now. Robert looked at him. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Years of grief stood between them. Finally, Ethan's voice broke. I heard what I expected to hear. Robert nodded slowly. And I failed to say what I meant. The words hung in the night air. Then Ethan took a shaky breath. I'm sorry. Robert looked at his son for a long time. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Why didn't you stop? Tears rolled down Ethan's face. Because every year you stayed. Silence. You came to everything. More silence. You remembered everything. His shoulders shook. And I was terrified that if I stood up, you'd leave again. Robert's expression crumbled. Not anger. Heartbreak. He crossed the distance between them and pulled his son into his arms. No speeches. No dramatic music. Just a father holding his child. A child holding his father back. Two people grieving the same woman. Two people loving each other badly but honestly. And standing in the doorway, I realized something. The truth hurts. But sometimes the truth also stops the bleeding. The movies always end too quickly after the reunion. The father forgives the son. The son apologizes. Everyone hugs. The screen fades to black. Real life doesn't work that way. Real life keeps going the next morning. The first breakfast after Robert learned the truth was one of the quietest meals I've ever shared. Not angry quiet. Careful quiet. The kind of quiet people use when they're afraid that one wrong sentence might break something fragile that has only just begun to heal. Robert made coffee. Ethan buttered toast. I scrambled eggs. Ordinary tasks. Extraordinary effort. At one point, Robert opened his mouth to say something, stopped himself, and stared out the window instead. A few minutes later, Ethan did exactly the same thing. For 32 years, I taught 4th grade. Trust me when I say this. Adults often communicate exactly like children when they're scared. By the end of the week, progress came in inches instead of miles. Robert no longer pushed Ethan's wheelchair into rooms out of habit. Ethan no longer pretended to need help reaching cabinets. Both noticed. Neither mentioned it. One afternoon, I found Robert standing in the garage staring at the wheelchair. Just staring. His hand rested lightly against one of the handles. It feels ridiculous, he admitted. What does missing this thing? He gave a short laugh. I hated this chair. I waited. I hated what it represented. His fingers tightened around the handle. But I also spent 3 years believing it meant my son was still here. He looked at me. And now I don't know what to do with that. There are some questions that don't have answers. Only time. The following Tuesday, Ethan asked his father to drive him somewhere. Just the two of them. No explanations. No details. Robert looked surprised. Sure. They were gone nearly 4 hours. When they returned, both looked exhausted. But lighter. Later that evening, Robert told me where they had gone. The cemetery. Susan Whitmore's grave sat beneath a large maple tree on a hillside outside Richmond. According to Robert, neither of them had visited together in years. Not really. Not the way they had that day. Ethan had stood there for nearly 20 minutes without speaking. Finally, he looked at the headstone and said, I think we both got stuck the day you left. Robert told me those words hit harder than anything else Ethan had said. Because they were true. Grief doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it disguises itself as anger. Sometimes as work. Sometimes as silence. Robert buried himself in taking care of Ethan. Ethan buried himself in needing to be taken care of. Both believed they were honoring Susan. Instead, they had built monuments to fear. Military family counseling began 2 weeks later. Robert invited me to join the first session. I declined. This part belongs to the two of you. And it did. There were arguments. There were tears. There were long drives home without much conversation. Healing rarely happens in straight lines, but healing was happening. One evening in early spring, I walked into the backyard and found Robert and Ethan arguing over fishing equipment. Actually arguing, not politely disagreeing. Arguing. Those hooks are too small. They're literally the size you taught me to use. That was before I learned better. You didn't learn better. You got older and stubborn. Robert looked offended. I was always stubborn. Exactly my point. I stood there smiling like an idiot. Because conflict, oddly enough, can be a wonderful sign. People don't argue when they believe a relationship is over. They argue when they believe it's worth saving. By May, Ethan had enrolled in summer driver's education classes. The instructor knew the family. The look on the man's face when Ethan walked into the classroom under his own power was almost comical. By June, Robert had stopped automatically reaching for the wheelchair ramp button in the garage. By July, the wheelchair itself had been moved into storage. Not thrown away, not destroyed. Just stored. Part of their history, no longer their future. Robert and I married in September. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant. A small ceremony at our church with neighbors, friends, veterans, former teachers, and far too many casseroles afterward. At 65 and 58, neither of us needed spectacle. We needed peace. Just before the ceremony began, Ethan walked over wearing a navy suit and a nervous expression. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He swallowed. "Would it be okay if I walked you down the aisle?" For a moment I couldn't speak. My husband Mark had died without sons. I had only Megan. I had never imagined hearing those words. I'd like that very much. So that's how it happened. Not with a wheelchair. Not with tragedy. A young man walked me toward a future his mother never got to see. Halfway down the aisle, I looked over and saw Robert wiping his eyes. The general noticed me noticing. He shrugged. Seasonal allergies. Inside a church? Very aggressive allergies. 20 years ago, I might have let him get away with that answer. Not anymore. At the reception, Robert raised his glass. "To second chances," he said. Then he looked toward Ethan. "And to saying things clearly while we still have time." Years had been lost. They would never get those years back. But they had tomorrow. Sometimes that has to be enough. If there's anything this story taught me, it's this. Love cannot survive on assumptions. People are not mind readers. The words we swallow today often become the regrets we carry tomorrow. So if someone matters to you, tell them. Call them. Visit them. Say the awkward thing. Ask the difficult question. And if this story reminded you of someone you've been meaning to reach out to, maybe today is a good day to do it. Thank you for spending this time with me and with the Whitmore family. If this story stayed with you, I'd be honored if you shared it with someone who might need it too.